Tak dobrý večer, Respolek. Já vás všechny vítám na posledním středověku jinak roku 2024. I will switch immediately to English since the last lecture of the year will be held in English by Igor Dorfmann-Lazarev, and I will just be introducing our guest because it is our, I would say, tradition to have one of the last středověk jinak of the year, someone coming from abroad. I believe this is important for us to remember that the borders of our Middle Ages are never ending, and this very case will be even more never ending. I'll not be making a very formal academic introduction, but Igor deserves to be introduced at least a bit because he's one of the most impressive globetrotters medieval history, and not only medieval history. Imagine he was born in Moscow and then traveled all around the world. He was teaching in the UK, in Germany. He received his PhD in France at the École pratique des hautes études under the direction of Jean-Pierre Maillet, and he actually works on everything we like, meaning medieval visual culture such as Akhtamar. He's interested in early medieval visual culture and obviously the sources of it in Armenian and Georgian texts. And he's as well a person who is crossing the border between what was formerly called Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which I find only extremely interesting as well. He's currently teaching at the St. Clement Ohridsky University in Sofia, and actually following his path through Europe would be really a lesson of how European integration can go on, with an impressive series of appointments, including an Humboldt Fellowship. He worked also in Germany. So it's really an extremely productive and extremely, I would say, cosmopolitan scholar in the best sense of this word. And we can say that he worked also on topics which are very vast. So he's mainly an historian from his training, but he's interested really both in visual culture, in also we can say art history, but also in the reception of pre-modern cultures. And we can say that his research goes in two main directions. One is really the pre-modern history, and the other, and we will be talking about it today, is how much the past is transformed by the last century of history. And I will remember the volume he edited in 2023, which is called Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus, Karabagh, Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijani contemporary geopolitical conflicts. And this is actually the volume we'll be hearing, I guess, a lot about today. And I think I will stop to speak right now, wishing you a lovely evening with the presentation of Igor, and expressing to him all our gratitude that you went to Brno so late in the year, almost at Christmas, and that you're with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is it open?
Yeah,
I need note.
just for the online though.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this generous presentation. I'm very glad to be with you. And thank you for your interest in this topic. So I was speaking about the South Caucasus, about the frontier, in particular the border regions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, addressing the following questions. Well, the main question that I'll try to address is the phenomenon of intentional destruction of historical monuments in our time. So the reasons, the moving forces, and how it is lived today, and what it means for us all, and how the destruction of historical monuments endangers the survival of historical societies, especially when we speak about small societies such as Caucasian peoples. So I will speak slowly, and if you have questions, you are most welcome to interrupt me and to ask either in the course of my paper or afterwards. I will be more than happy to discuss, to reflect together with you on the questions that are of your concern and of your interest. So I shall first focus on the volume that a colleague of mine and I published last year. So that Ivan Folletti just introduced, Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus, Karabagh, Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijan in Contemporary Geopolitical Conflict. This book analyzes the ways in which the architectural and cultural landscape of the South Caucasus correlates with its national identities, the older and the younger ones. In our focus in this book are two regions situated in the east of historical Armenia, Karabagh, also known by the ancient Armenian name of Artsakh, and Nakhichevan. Let me show them on the map. So here is a contemporary map of the contemporary region, and you see, so Armenia has a peculiar shape on the contemporary map, and there are two regions. One of them is situated to the east, right? It was a self-proclaimed Republic of Karabagh, and the other one is enclave, which is called Nakhichevan. So the continuous Armenian presence in Karabagh and Nakhichevan over 2 millennia, or perhaps much more, is attested by chronicles and by numerous monuments. And amongst the ancient, medieval, and early modern monuments are carved stele, cemeteries, churches, crypts, monasteries, other pilgrimage sites, various examples of civil architecture, and inscriptions on stone in particular. These sites have since centuries served as points of convergence for the Armenians, places of their commemorative and religious celebrations, as well as feasting, socialization, and hospitality. The past century has been marked by a progressive disappearance of Armenian monuments and cultural institutions on all the territories under the control of Baku. First, on the southern slopes of the Greater Caucasus at the beginning of the century and during the First World War and shortly afterwards. So it means here in this region. Well, I will cite a few names: Aresh, Gökçay, Zakatala, Sheki, Shamakhi, and Kuba. Then in the city of Baku, today the capital of Azerbaijan, in the region of Ganzak, here, this region, and in Nakhichevan. And the book aims to raise the awareness of the danger that today, in a likely manner, is threatening the architectural and artistic heritage of Karabagh. Let me show you the table of contents. As you see, the book is composed of 3 parts. So in the first is focusing on ancient, late ancient and medieval history. It discusses in particular historical monuments of these 2 regions and speaks about the origins of Christianity, the Christianization of the South Caucasus, Armenia, and the territory of the present-day Azerbaijan. We'll return to this topic. The second part examines the genesis of Azerbaijani nationalism between the 19th and the 21st century. And it discusses it from 2 perspectives. Again, I will speak at greater extent about that. So the Turkish component and the Soviet component. And the third part examines the stages of the usurpation of Armenian cultural heritage. It It contains studies, articles written by explorers that since the 1960s visited these regions and sometimes at with the danger for their life and their freedom, as Arkam Ayvazyan and Hamlet Petrosyan, one stemming from Nakhichevan, the other from Karabagh. And then it examines the way in which cultural monuments are presented in various historiographical works and how they're instrumentalized. So the concern that has accompanied us throughout our work is that the losses endured by the Armenians threatened their very existence as a historical society. In order briefly to clarify this concern, I would like to evoke the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin, who in summer 1944, that is almost a year before the end of the Second World War, elaborated definitions for the policies adopted by Nazi forces against various national and ethnic groups in the occupied Europe. Lemkin thus distinguished several techniques of genocide. It is Lemkin's term. Not being a jurist, I am not qualified to determine which specific cases can be defined as genocide. Besides, over the past decades, this term has frequently been misused. But I'm only speaking as a historian interested in Lemkin's perception of the moment that we now see as the darkest moment of Europe's history. And I ask myself whether the categories that he elaborated may not aptly describe the danger faced today by the Armenians. Indeed, Lemkin spoke of a genocide in the cultural field. Examining diverse regional cases, he claimed that as a result of aggression against cultural institutions of the Poles, the Slovenes, and the Jews, these peoples were, I quote, deprived of inspiration from the existing cultural and artistic values, which rendered impossible national creative activities. Consequently, Lemkin estimated that the survival of the nations themselves was endangered. A nation was defined by him in a very particular sense, not by any ethnic or territorial criterion, nor indeed with any reference to autochthonous indigenous roots, but precisely as, I quote again, a human group capable of making original creative contribution to the world. And this perspective seems to me particularly apposite in the framework of this discussion. The origins of cultural erasure in Azerbaijan, which we have been observing since the 1990s, are one of the main questions addressed in this book. We show that these destructions are not an outcome of inter-ethnic or inter-religious hostilities, but are a deliberate step undertaken by the state of Azerbaijan in its project of engineering a new national identity. According to Baku authorities, there is no place in this identity for any trace Armenian, be it a church, a chronicle, an inscription on stone, a carpet, or even a name. During the last invasion of Karabagh, a museum, so between 2020 and 2023, a museum of geology, a collection of minerals, a collection of carpets, were also plundered and destroyed. The shaping of a new national identity and the historical revisionism that it underlies are analyzed in the book from various perspectives. One of the remote roots of the cultural erasure has rightly been recognized in the Young Turks' ideas and policies. The Young Turks was a nationalist movement in Turkey at the beginning of the century, which was responsible for the genocide in the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 16, and was also active in the Caucasus, that is, across the frontier on the territory of the Russian Empire and then on the territory of the independent states of the South Caucasus. It is important to stress that the nationalist movements in Turkey and Azerbaijan developed since the beginning of the years 1900 through close exchanges. The repressive operations that the envoys of the Committee Union and Progress, the committee formed by Young Turks, and Turkish military forces, the repressive operations that these forces directed against the Armenians in the southeastern Caucasus after the disintegration of the Russian front in 1917 received a vast popular support amongst the local Muslim populations. They were followed by destructions of Armenian monuments and cultural institutions. Yet, more than 70 years would elapse before Armenian monuments in the regions of Ganja, Nakhichevan, and eventually Karabagh would systematically be obliterated. So the scale of the recent instances of erasure is unmatched by the earlier cases of violence and destruction. On the territory of Nakhichevan alone, circa 27,000 Armenian monuments were annihilated between late 1990s and the early years 2000. And explaining these acts is an impelling historiographical task. Let me show you a map from this book, a map composed by Harutyun Khachaturian, where he indicates the monuments that were documented in historiographic literature in the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century. And so on the left map, right, and the marked with red, and on the map below with the dark points, so the black points are indicated the monuments that have been destroyed. So you see on the territory of Nakhichevan, practically everything that was known to scholars at the beginning of the century and in the course of the 20th century as well was destroyed. And so our worry is that the same destiny may befall Karabakh. One of the persons who was responsible for the documenting the monuments of Nakhichevan during the recent decades was Arkam Ayvazyan. I show his portrait first of all. Oh, no. Let me switch to this. Here we are. So it is Arkam Ayvazyan. So I will shortly tell you his story. He was born in the region of Nakhichevan, and I think that shortly after the war, of the Second World War. And as a youngster, he knew almost next to nothing about the ancient history of his region. Then he became a student in the University of Yerevan, and as a student he received an appointment to write about the region of his origin. It was the appointment that all the students in the group received. Then he realized that it is very difficult to discover the history because the books were inaccessible. So he managed to compose his first bibliography. Then he realized that there are numerous churches, monasteries, and stelae that are described in literature that he tried to visit. So he traveled there with his camera, and almost immediately he was arrested and interrogated. His camera was taken. It happened in the middle of the 60s. Then later on, he discovered that the person who was interrogating him was the head of the KGB and the father of the future leader of Azerbaijan, the present leader. That the name of that head of the KGB was Heydar Aliyev. And he told him, forget that there had ever been Armenians in Nakhichevan. And then he realized that it is a calling of his life. So he accomplished numerous travels while trying in a hidden way, concealing himself and dissimulating his presence to photograph churches, monasteries, and stelae. Here are a few monuments. Here is the cemetery that he photographed during his travels. In order to be able to photograph them in a systematic way, he would take with himself a thread with which he would tie the stele that he had already photographed, and then proceed to the next one, in order not to repeat the photographs. Several times he was arrested, detained in the police, and then he would return and try to repeat this task. In this way, we have today photographs of numerous of these stelae. So that is the general view of the cemetery on the banks of the river Araxes. And it is one of the moments of the destruction. The destruction was photographed from the opposite side of the river Araxes from Iran. UNESCO and other international authorities were alerted, but nobody was able to stop the destruction. And the answer that the Armenians often received from UNESCO, that it is better not to raise voice in fear that it may make things even worse. Today, obviously, there are no traces of this cemetery in Nakhichevan. Here is again a photo taken in 1970s by Arkam Ayvazyan. And here are several photographs of the destruction. Yeah. So the three generations intervening between the young Turks' activity in the Caucasus and the contemporary events were raised, educated, and socialized in the USSR, a state whose state borders, as you know well, were closed almost hermetically and whose populations were submitted to close ideological surveillance. Therefore, the spheres allowing Soviet citizens independent socialization were critically reduced. And these circumstances unsettled the claim of continuity between the nationalist movements preceding the Soviet era, so the Young Turks and their activities, and those following the demise of the USSR. The singular nature of the events of the last decades can only be clarified if we examine the social, intellectual, and institutional history of the USSR. Thus, we can aim at reconstructing the cultural and emotional climate in which those generations transmitted their collective memory, shaped their national identities, and nurtured their animosities. The self-perception of the societies composing the USSR and their reciprocal relationships were largely conditioned by the official understanding of nationhood. By the middle of the 1930s, each republic of the USSR was identified with one particular titular nation, while each of the Soviet nations was progressively conceived of as an innate hereditary category, determined by genetic origins and unchangeable characteristics. Estnoi were thought of in the Soviet Union as stable entities, existing along millennia independently of social organization, cultural and religious institutions, or foreign invasions. This vision can be evinced from both Stalin's programmatic texts and works written by nationalist Soviet intellectuals of the post-Stalinist era and post-Soviet era. In order to act autonomously as a titular nation, the population appointed to this task had to prove a sufficient degree of development of its material culture on the territory of the republic. So each republic, as you know, had its own titular population, but there was only one titular population per republic. Indeed, according to Engels, who was one of Lenin's and Stalin's most quoted authors, it is only by proving that it has a history of its own, eigene Geschichte, that a nation, hence the Azeris in the Soviet state, could become a viable nation, haben eine Lebensfähigkeit. On the eve of the Soviet era, the disparity between the Armenians and the Azeris in the development of literature and architecture was a fact known to scholars. So, in his History of the Exploration of the East in Europe and in Russia, published in St. Petersburg in 1911, the eminent Russian Turkologist Vasily Bartol noted that, I quote, amongst the Muslim population of the Caucasus, the interest in one's past is until now developed, до сих пор развит, to a much lower degree than amongst the Armenians and the Georgians. The new state's official doctrine implied, however, that a change of this situation must be registered as soon as the proletarian revolution has taken place. The task set before the Republican authorities was, consequently, to produce proofs of the progress achieved since the Sovietization. In 1924, Bartold was invited to read a course of lectures on the history of the Turkic peoples in the University of Baku. Consequently, in the second edition of his History of the Exploration of the East, published in Leningrad in 1925, he could amend his previous affirmation, transposing it to the past tense. The interest was until recent times developed. До последнего времени был развит to a much lower degree. However, in order to attain a numeric predominance of material remains ascribable to the Azeris, predominance which was now regarded as an indispensable prerequisite for the construction of a nation. Multiple Armenian monuments in Azerbaijan would, from the 1920s onwards, be demolished or deformed, being also misrepresented in the new historiographic and ethnographic publications. The concept of a singular titular nation endowed with privileged rights to cultural life within a given territory was grounded in Engels's idea that small nations had to be sacrificed to the logic of historical development. In 1849, Engels wrote, I quote, "There is no country in Europe which does not have in some corner or other one or several ruined fragments of peoples, Völkerruinen, the remnant, Überbleibsel, of a former population that was suppressed and held in bondage by the nation which later became the main vehicle of historical development, Trägerin der geschichtlichen Entwicklung. These relics of a nation are mercilessly trampled underfoot in the course of history. Reste einer von dem Gang der Geschichte unbarmherzig zertretenen Nation." Therefore, Engels does not hesitate to call such societies national waste, Völkerabfälle. Within such a multinational state as the Soviet Union, this picture, raised to the status of an official theory, considerably limited the perspectives of coexistence on the same territory of cultural institutions belonging to various ethnic and linguistic groups, most obviously so in the South Caucasus. The Armenians of Azerbaijan fell inevitably within the category of those peoples who were doomed, according to the new understanding, to be trampled underfoot. The Soviet Constitution of 1936 consolidated the status of the republics as constitutive elements of the Soviet state, thereby codifying a list of titular nations. The constitution was promulgated whilst a vast campaign launched between 1935 and 1937 over the expanse of the USSR was aimed at suppressing various Soviet institutions which had previously represented the non-titular nations of the same republics of the Union. Local administrative structures, linguistic diversity in schools and universities, theaters, radio broadcasting, and newspapers. The political outlook of what Engels calls ruined fragments of peoples was also endowed by him with specific moral characteristics. In agreement with his own and Marx's deterministic vision of the course of history, he observed that such populations, I quote, always become fanatical standard bearers of counter-revolution and remain so until their complete extirpation or loss of their national character, ihrer gänzlichen Vertilgung oder Entnationalisierung. Just as their whole existence in general is itself a protest against a great historical revolution. End of quotation. Engels also expressed his confidence that, I quote again, the next world war will bring about the disappearance from the face of the earth, vom Erdboden verschwinden machen, not only of reactionary classes and dynasties, but also of entire reactionary peoples. And that too is a step forward. End of quotation. The virulence of Engels's language, significantly edulcorated in the canonical English translation of his writings published in New York in 1977, is revelatory of the challenge that the vitality of national movements, and in particular in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, in Slavic countries and in Hungary, posed to him and to Marx. Let us observe that in the West, Engels's derogatory attitude to the claims of non-dominant national groups has until recently impinged on the perception of national movements also beyond the perimeter of Marxist thinkers. This partly explains the prevailing indifference, sometimes verging on hostility, in a number of Western authors to the Armenians' aspiration to the autonomy of Karabagh. The principle of self-determination of the peoples, which was initially espoused by the Bolsheviks, most notably in the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, promulgated in November 1917, and signed by Stalin and Lenin, could have allowed Soviet nations to claim a free development of their cultures. In the USSR, however, the deterministic teaching distinguishing between vehicles of historical development and, on the one hand, and on the other hand, reactionary nations, eventually deprived the non-titular ethno-linguistic groups of arguments justifying their free development and maintenance of their culture. The principle of self-determination of peoples was quite naturally abandoned. There was no place for national consciousness or national and political will, which would allow to shape new polities, overcoming all old conflicts. Only national belonging, принадлежность, was recognized in the USSR. It was predetermined by one's ethnic roots and was registered in the passports and all other official documents. Unlike the writers of the pre-revolutionary era, Soviet authors almost never spoke of cultural identity, form of thought, образ мысли, self-consciousness, самосознание, will or orientation, let alone self-determination. National belonging thus could also demand the subdual to a despot who was recognized as a national leader, as it demands also today. Relying on the concept of vehicle of historical development, Lenin regarded, some 3 months after the October Revolution, the Federation of Nations as a transitory status in the way to their complete fusion and the formation of a centralized state headed by Russia. In September 1922, the Bolshevist Party appointed a commission presided by Stalin with the task of elaborating a constitution of federal state. Its draft implied that the republics were eventually to be absorbed within the Russian Federation, while the government of the Russian Federation was to become that of the whole state. Yet, for both Lenin and Stalin, ethnic identity survived the proletarian revolution, and a complete fusion of nations could only occur, according to them, in the communist future. Before that eschatological stage would be attained, ethnic identities represented for them political factors of the first plan. This is already clearly reflected in Stalin's essay, Marxism and the Question of Nationalities, composed in 1913, on Lenin's direct instructions. It was to become a foundational document of the politics of nationalities in the USSR, a sphere recognized as Stalin's specialty in the party. 4 years later, Stalin would be promoted to the post of Commissar for Nationalities in the first Bolshevist government. The thesis that he first defined in 1913, the Soviet ruler would reaffirm more boldly in 1930s. Ever since, the conception of nationhood would remain the nucleus declared or implicit, of Soviet ideology. In order to assure the principle of centralized state, bilateral relations between neighboring republics would usually be discouraged. This facilitated Moscow's intervention in the government of the republics, asserting Russia's role as the vehicle of historical development and an indispensable cultural mediator. The past of each republic was intended to be distinct. Each had to investigate the roots of its titular nation within the territory that had been allotted it. Thus, Armenian scholars were not allowed to participate in the investigation of the Caucasian Albanian antiquities, although the main sources for the history of this civilization are written in ancient Armenian. So here I mention the ancient kingdom of Caucasian Albania. Caucasian Albania is a different country. It's unrelated to Albania in the Balkans. Caucasian Albania was the third kingdom in the South Caucasus, beside Armenia and Georgia, and it mainly occupied the territories of present-day Azerbaijan. So it was a kingdom that was centered on the lowland of the South Caucasus. And being more accessible for foreign invasions, it was more easily conquered by Arabs, and by the 8th century, the ancient Albanian language almost vanished. And therefore, in the subsequent period, the main language of the Christian civilization, of the survival of the Christian civilization on the territory of Caucasian Albania, were written in Armenian. So in particular, I should like to mention one author, was called Moses of, it is a little bit complicated, Kahankatui. So Moses Kahankatvatsi in Armenian, or Dashoransi. It was a writer of the 10th century, the author of the only known history of Caucasian Albania. So this book bears the name History of Caucasian Albanians. It is a book written in Armenian. So from the text, by analyzing this book, we may come to the conclusion that it is not a translation. Why? Because it is written by somebody who has the Armenian cultural consciousness. So when he speaks about Albania, or even the territory of adjoining Caucasian Albania, so the territory of Karabagh, for example, he speaks of the eastern countries, or speaking in particular of Karabagh, he says our frontier regions or our eastern regions. So this repetitive mention of the east indicates that at the center of his map is the valley of Ararat. So that explains his Armenian identity. Nevertheless, he's the very rich source on the late ancient and early medieval history of Caucasian Albania. During the Soviet era, since the Caucasian Albania was identified with the territory of Azerbaijan, the Armenians were not expected or were not even allowed to study the antiquities situated on the territory of Azerbaijan. And this restriction contributed to the reciprocal alienation of the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians, and to the growing illusion in Azerbaijan that Armenia is unrelated to the history of Caucasian Albania, and indeed to the history of Azerbaijan. Throughout the Soviet era, Armenian scholars were also often denied access to Armenian antiquities on other territories of Azerbaijan, and especially in the Autonomous Republic of Nakhichevan, which since 1921 had been placed under the protectorate of Azerbaijan. Protectorate is the terminology of the Treaty of Moscow signed in 1921 between the Soviet government and the Turkish government. In this way, every possible Armenian claim on this territory or its cultural heritage was intended to lose any substance. Eventually, these restrictive measures paved the way for the consolidation of national extremism in Azerbaijan, which denied the Armenians any degree of participation in the cultural life of this republic. Claims of autonomous cultural development advanced by non-titular national groups could, in the light of the state doctrine, be regarded as anti-revolutionary. In 1938, the first secretary of the Azerbaijan Communist Party, Mir Jafar Bagirov, would suppress the instruction in numerous local languages of Azerbaijan, in Avar, in Kurdish, in Lak, in Lezgian, Talish, Tat, and Sakhur. This step was justified by him with recourse to two arguments. The true identity of these populations was none other than Azerbaijani. Secondly, only instruction delivered in the Azerbaijani language could implement Bolshevist control over their cultural development. Therefore, claimed Azerbaijan's ruler, calling in question the Azerbaijani identity of these populations amounted to colluding with the enemies of the Soviet state. In this way, the enforcement of Soviet ideology in Azerbaijan as elsewhere could serve as an excuse for promoting the cause of ethnic and racial nationalism. With the strategy of proving the existence of ancient indigenous roots, ancient history and archaeology were particularly cultivated in the USSR. Within each republic, the exploration of the material remains of ancient civilizations would occur at the expense of the populations of diverse origin, who for centuries had been rooted in that same territory, as the Armenians were on the territory of Azerbaijan. Since the nature of each nation was expected to be primordial, homogeneous, and monolithic, each had to possess its own material antiquities, which it did not share with others. Let me notice that these developments afford a key for the understanding of much vaster phenomenon characterizing the geopolitics of the Caucasus and the Black Sea region. Thus, since the end of the 1930s, the roots of the Russians were claimed by Soviet archaeologists to be discovered in the Upper Paleolithic culture of the Middle Dnieper area, it is in the heart of Ukraine. It was contended that this region had since followed uninterrupted material and cultural autochthonous development, which lately allowed to vindicate this territory as an inalienable part of Russia. In shaping separate ethno-territorial identities for peoples over the whole of the USSR, the Soviet authorities pursued a specific strategy in the case of the Turcophone populations of the Caucasus and Central Asia, instilling in each of them the idea of distinct autochthonous origins was a means to detach them from the history of the Turkic invasions, and thus to counter the spread of pan-Turkist tendencies from across the southern state border of the USSR. The foundations of a fictitious historiography were laid between the late 1930s and the early 1960s by 4 successive editions of the official history of Azerbaijan. Each advanced a divergent theory of origins of the Azerbaijani people. For example, in the second version of the history, published in 1941, several months before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the preeminent place was accorded to the Medes, Media, south of the Caspian Sea. So I quote, "The only scientifically correct point of view on the origin of the Azerbaijani people is given by Comrade Stalin, and it links the contemporary Azerbaijanis with their remote ancestors, the Medes." End of quotation. The theory that prevailed since the beginning of the 1960s, however, claimed an uninterrupted ethnic and cultural continuity between the Turkic-speaking Azerbaijanis and the ancient kingdom of Caucasian Albania, to which I referred earlier on. This would become the official doctrine of the Azerbaijani state, while any link of Caucasian Albania to Armenia and the Armenians would be excluded. Today, this denial supports the systematic destruction of Armenian monuments in Azerbaijan. If any inscription, any cross carved in stone, or any altar irrefutably reveals the Armenian identity of the monument, it must be erased or mutilated. So let me show, before I conclude this part of the talk, a monument restored in Azerbaijan shortly before the demise of the Soviet Union. It shows what how the monuments of architecture are expected to appear. So you see, it looks artificial. There are no crosses, no inscriptions, no any sign of a concrete presence of a concrete culture, which are so characteristic of any Armenian church, which, if you have ever visited the Caucasus. So this kind of monuments allows the Azerbaijani authorities to create a fantastic historiography of Caucasian Albania, which is unrelated to Armenia. And our fear is that the monuments, numerous monuments of Karabagh, may be transformed in the same way. I don't know how much time I have, because it is 8 o'clock.
We can rest again slowly.
Yeah. So, first, let me ask whether you have questions. Then we'll proceed, maybe following your questions, following the particular points that you would like to discuss. Yes, please.
Just a matter of realpolitik that led the Soviet authorities to favor the Azeri population in the area?
You see, there was the idea that the area has to be divided, and there were approximately 60% of the population of the present-day Azerbaijan was in between the 1920s and 30s of Azerbaijani of Turkic origin. It was a matter of, at the same time, of political convenience and a certain idea of symmetry, since the Caucasus had Christian populations and Muslim populations. So the Christian populations were embodied by the Armenians and the Georgians. And there were numerous Muslim populations. At the beginning, Azerbaijan tried very logically to present various Muslim populations, not only Turkic-speaking populations, but also the Muslims of Georgia, of Armenia, and of Dagestan. But as the idea of titular nation consolidated itself, there had to be necessarily an identity between a population, a language, an ethnic origin, so imagined ethnic origin, and its material culture.
I would have just a short, in some sense. So, if I get it well, we are building up the idea of the titular nation through hypothetical roots or historical roots, which will be unique, right? So Albania becomes the sort of idealized past for Azeri nation, while it does not correspond to historical reality in the sense that the Turkophone population arrived to the region after actually the existence of Caucasian Albania. And so my question is to which extent this fiction, because it is a historical fiction, was challenged by someone or not? Because, I mean, historically speaking, you can be belonging to any ideological group, but if someone tells you, okay, your roots are the Christian Albania, and you know that your language is Turcophone, and very likely you are descendant of people who arrived later in the region, so how can you manage to put these things together?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the solutions was to claim that actually the Turkic language existed already in Caucasian Albania, and to interpret it was a path followed also in Turkey. When the origin of an inscription, of a language, of a word is unknown, it is proposed that the origin is Turkish or Azerbaijani. There is a great similarity between the nationalist historiography in Turkey and in Azerbaijan. On the other hand, what is particularly destructive in the idea of the titular nations, that there are no contacts, no intermingling is contemplated. So each one has to explore its own roots. And these roots are imagined to develop in the sense of historical development and with the conclusion of the composition of the Soviet Union. So the war in the Soviet Union claims expressed by archaeologists that the creation of the Soviet Union were already the conditions for the future creation of the Soviet Union were already on the territory, on the terrain since late antiquity. So it was preconditioned that such a development will later take place. Now, in the Soviet times, especially since the 60s, the historiographic schools developed almost independently from each other. So if you compare the article, so the entries dedicated to Caucasian Albania in the encyclopedia published in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, you discover that not only that the stories are completely different, but also the references, so the bibliographical lists attached, appended to these articles do not even overlap. There are no common authorities that scholars in Armenia and in Azerbaijan would discuss.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, please, Serena.
By this development, the destruction of Armenian monuments wasn't accelerated then after 1990, because then the Soviet framework and the whole idea of justification that we will become a titular nation has
Collapsed.
so why the urge to continue even yeah exactly.
I'm just for the people online repeat the question of Serena, which is if this is the situation, why after the collapse of Soviet Union and the end of the titular nation, the process of destruction did accelerate?
Yes. Well, because once there is no central power that may hamper the process, the identities that had been consolidated over decades of nationalist historiography and nationalist journalism, and in the popular sentiment, they receive their expression, unrestrained expression. That's what happens. Usually, what we see in the development, very more generally in the historical development, it's always a result of the decay of the preceding decades, right? The cultural climate, of the education, of a certain social climate, psychological mood that had been created and had been consolidated during the previous decades. This is what happened in the post-Soviet period, during the post-Soviet period.
You are closely arrived. No, this is Susan having a question, please.
At this church of Vatican, and you were talking about like this erasing of symbols of like crosses or even like inscription, and I was wondering if also like the contrary process of like adding some elements to like maybe some kind of artificial new inscription in other languages, if this happened or not.
So the question I'll repeat is that we see the canceling of crosses in Armenian language, but Susanna is just asking if there were also additions, so inscriptions in another language in Armenian or something of this kind.
Whether inscriptions were added to,
Yes.
to monuments. Not that I know of. There were attempts in Azerbaijan to discover Albanian inscriptions, because Albanian inscriptions were discovered, very fragmentary inscriptions, were discovered in the 1950s. So there was there were several discoveries. One of them was in an Armenian manuscript. The other fragments were discovered on the territory of Azerbaijan. Yeah. So since then, since 1950s, there was always a hope that new inscriptions can appear, and sometimes new non-described inscriptions were identified by travelers, by scholars in Azerbaijan, and who suspected that these were Albanian inscriptions. They consulted independent authorities, so to say. And when such independent authorities assured them that these were Armenian inscriptions, these inscriptions disappeared. So there were several, there was a real hope that a new Albanian past may be discovered, which would allow to build a historiography independent of the Armenians present in Azerbaijan and of the Armenian neighbors, because it is the double exclusion of any interaction with neighbors and exclusion of other or foreign hostile, so ethnic elements considered to be hostile. And yeah, so many inscriptions were erased.
Okay, I have maybe a concluding question. If you just move here to the camera a little, thank you. It's just a concluding question from my side because paradoxically enough, you have thought that within the international cosmopolitan Soviet Union, with all nations supposed to stay together, we have two different, or many different stories written. But what about the central direction? Because I was today reading with Margarita the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, where a third story is told, the one of the Armenian and Azeri people, friendly and lovely, deciding to create the Karabagh independence, for example. So how this was just fitting together? You have one Armenian story, one Azeri story, and then the Soviet one. So how do you fix all that together in a sort of logical structure? Because the contradiction might have been evident to everybody.
So the idea was that there was the ruling idea was that there was a historical development, idea of progress that resulted in the revolution and in the building of communist society. So all these things are should be familiar to you. And the guiding role of the Russians was affirmed, right? So that would, and it was also important that the Russians should act as the mediators. It was not usually mediation was not contemplated between different republics, bypassing Russians. And in fact, this avoidance of bilateral contacts, bilateral cooperation, contributed to this reciprocal alienation and to the fact not only alienation but incapacity to conceive of a common political action and conceive a political action that would enable the neighboring nations to overcome their conflicts.
Well, thank you so much. I think we can express our gratitude to Igor for this wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And we will likely let the following discussion to the event which are expected to have just right now. So we say hello to the viewers online and